Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online component of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, aka the San Francisco Bay Area, an offering of respect at the outset for those who have come before us as stewards of the land. This afternoon, City Lights and Princeton University Press celebrate the launch and publication of the newly released book, AI Snake Oil: What Artificial Intelligence Can Do, What It Can't, and How to Tell the Difference. It's published, of course, by Princeton University Press. We are honored to have with us today its authors, Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor. Time Magazine has dubbed them amongst the 100 most influential people in AI. They will be speaking about this most timely of subjects. There is a tremendous amount of hype and misinformation surrounding AI, to say the least. The book AI Snake Oil aims to cut through the confusion and offers a clear understanding of what AI is, how it works, and why it oftentimes doesn't. It helps us separate the useful facts from marketing propaganda aimed to sell us a bill of goods that may not function as advertised. The book provides practical suggestions that can benefit both creators and users alike. And for those of us who consider AI an existentialist risk, the authors posit we should be far more concerned by what people do with AI than about anything that AI will do to us. The book also warns of the dangers of a world where AI continues to be controlled by largely unaccountable big tech companies. So all in all, this is a welcome and sobering book that has much to offer us a realistic view of AI and how we can stand in relation to it. So we are happy and honored to be launching the book here today. Arvind Narayanan is professor of computer science at Princeton University and director of its Center for Information Technology Policy. He led the Princeton Web Transparency and Accountability Project to uncover how companies collect and use our personal information. His work was amongst the first to show how machine learning reflects cultural stereotypes. He is the co-author of the books Bitcoin and Cryptocurrency Technologies and Fairness and Machine Learning. He is also the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. Sayash Kapoor is a PhD candidate in computer science at Princeton. His research focuses on the societal impact of AI. He previously worked on AI in industry and academia at places like Facebook, Columbia University, and EPFL Switzerland. He is a recipient of the Best Paper Award and an Impact Recognition Award at ACM Fact and ACM CSCW. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Arvind Narayanan and Sayash Kapoor. It is a pleasure and an honor to be able to launch your book and to have you with us today, gentlemen. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that kind introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Arvind Narayanan, and let me go ahead and share my screen. I hope you're able to see that. Hi, what is AI snake oil? Let's launch right into it. Let me give you an example. You may have seen many hiring automation companies claim that they have built AI to assess job candidates, not necessarily through their resumes, but by having those candidates upload 30-second videos. And videos, not even of them talking about their job qualifications, but about their hobbies and other, whatever they want to talk about. And what the companies claim is that AI can actually figure out, using the candidate's body language, facial expressions, things like that, their personality, and how suitable they're going to be for a particular job. So this is from an actual promotional video of an actual company in the space. And you can see here the score that it has supposedly produced for this particular candidate. I love the precision 8.98. That's apparently how we can know that it's so accurate. And on the top right here, you can see that this person has been categorized as a change agent, and various other things about him have been deciphered by AI. Now, if this kind of smells fishy to you, you're not alone. There is no known way by which this kind of thing can work. And as far as we can tell, this is just an elaborate random number generator. This is the kind of thing we mean when we say AI snake oil. It's AI that doesn't work, and we have strong reasons to suspect cannot work. So having said that, let's get a little bit deeper. Let me tell you what we've found in our research for this book as the single most confusing thing about AI. And that is that AI is a kind of umbrella term for a set of loosely related technologies. So on the one hand is ChatGPT, which you're all familiar with. I don't have to tell you much about. It's a type of generative AI. In addition to text, generative AI can also output images, videos, code, music, voices, so many other things. So there's a lot of hype around generative AI, but it is, in fact, a technology where there has been remarkable progress in the last few years. In contrast to generative AI is something like this. It could be a bank that uses AI to predict how much of a risk a person is if they apply for a loan, for instance. There's a reason that both of these are called AI. They have something in common. They're both examples of machine learning or learning from data, but in our view, the differences overwhelm the similarities in the domains in which these two types of technologies are used, what they're good for, what the risks are, what types of guardrails they need. These two really don't have much in common. And so we think it's tremendously confusing to talk about both of these technologies under this umbrella term AI. And it's also been called a suitcase word. And the idea is that you open up a suitcase and there's a lot of unrelated things in there. So the approach we take in this book is not to make broad brush statements about all of AI, but instead to look in detail at many of the most important types of AI that we tend to encounter in our everyday lives and in our workplace. So predictive AI, the reason we call it that is because it's fundamentally about making decisions about people by predicting their future behavior or outcomes. So what they might do in the future or what might happen to them in the future. So the bank is interested in predicting if a person will pay back a loan. Predictive AI is used in the criminal justice system. How risky is a defendant? How likely are they to reoffend if they are released before their trial? And if they're decided to be too risky, then based on this automated risk scoring, that person might be denied their freedom before their trial, which could be months or years. So predictive AI is used to make enormously consequential decisions about people. It's used in the medical system. It's used in education. It's used in hiring, as we talked about in many, many other areas. Generative AI, we've already talked about a little bit. So we have a couple of chapters about predictive AI, a couple of chapters about generative AI in our book. And we talk about why it is that predicting the future is hard. I mean, that's something we know intuitively, but there's a lot of evidence from social science for why, when it comes to people's behavior, social systems, etc., it's genuinely hard, whether it's a person doing the prediction or an automated system with a lot of data, why it's hard to make those predictions. And when it comes to generative AI, we acknowledge that this technology has made a lot of progress, but we talk about how nonetheless it's been overhyped, why it probably can't do some of the things that people think it can. We also talk about the algorithms, the AI algorithms used on social media. And maybe one other big category of AI is perhaps robotics. There's industrial robots, of course, and governments are users of robotics. Drones are a prominent example. And in the consumer space, self-driving cars are probably the kind of robot that we're most familiar with. We briefly talk about robotics in the book. We don't have a whole chapter on it, and let me tell you why. And it relates to a kind of amusing definition of AI that actually has an important point behind it. And that definition is that AI is whatever hasn't been done yet. And what this means is that we generally use the term AI when we're talking about a form of automation that is still new, doesn't work well, whose societal effects aren't understood and are probably double-edged, and so on. But in a lot of cases, eventually the technology starts working well enough. And when that happens, it kind of fades into the background. And we don't think about it too much. We don't call it AI. And that's a good thing, So these are all examples of tools in our everyday life that do useful things for us. At one point, a lot of these would have been called AI, but today not so much. Here's more examples, right? Even spell check would have been considered an example of AI at one point. And the reason I mention this is that we can hope and we predict that this will happen with many types of AI that are really problematic today. So self-driving cars, for instance, are in the news a lot because they still cause many accidents and deaths. But we do think that this is fundamentally an engineering problem that will get solved. It is true that AI developers have repeatedly uh, underestimated how hard it is to solve this problem, but eventually it will get solved. And we think things like self-driving cars will one day fade into the background. Uh, and people often ask us, why are you talking about, why do you have a whole book writing about the negatives of AI and not the positives of AI? So I very much want to acknowledge that this book is not an anti-technology screed. There are many types of AI that are useful in our lives. We want more of them. However, in order to get there, we do have to talk about the kinds of AI that are problematic and see whether those harms can be addressed, how they can be regulated, and whether there are types of AI that we need to push back and not deploy at all. So that's what this book is about. And I want to give you a couple of principles and then give you a few brief glimpses of what's in the book, and then we'll start a discussion with Sayash and Peter, and then we'll have a Q&A. So one principle that gradually became clear to us as we were working on the book is that AI can be harmful both when it works and when it doesn't. So in the case of the hiring algorithm, we think it's harmful because it's not doing much. It's actually not good at picking out candidates who will perform well from those who won't. And we oppose it for that reason. But that's not always the case. A good example of where this confusion arises is in facial recognition. 10 years ago, facial recognition didn't work very well. It had a very high error rate, and there are many civil society organizations that began opposing the use of facial recognition on the basis that it didn't work well. However, that's a technology that's been improving dramatically. Certainly, it still makes mistakes, and if facial recognition is deployed improperly, let's say on grainy surveillance footage instead of proper photographs, then it can certainly fail. But if used properly, facial recognition today is surprisingly accurate compared to 10 years ago. And this is important because the harms of facial recognition today arise primarily because of how well it works and not how poorly it works. So we're talking about the fact that oppressive governments, for instance, can and do use facial recognition for mass surveillance. So it is on that basis that we must oppose certain applications of AI. Instead, if we paint all AI with a broad brush and oppose facial recognition on the basis that it doesn't work, then we're playing into the hands of facial recognition companies who are going to come back to us with data and say, no, your information is outdated and works really well, and continue selling facial recognition technology for dubious purposes. Another point we make in the book is that just because AI works well and just because you can use AI in a particular context doesn't mean that you should. I'll give you an example of this that's actually very recent and so is not in the book. And this is about an election in Wyoming. Apparently, there's a candidate for mayor in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who wants a chatbot to run the city. He calls it VIC for Virtual Integrated Citizen, but it just seems to be ChatGPT behind the scenes. But VIC certainly seems more sophisticated. And this is an interesting application to consider. The person advocating for this claims that ChatGPT has an IQ of 155 and claims that we should defer to its decisions about various things, how much to spend on infrastructure, and even topics like book bans. So what's interesting about this to me is that, first of all, the notion of IQ is not a relevant construct for machines. So I think the idea that it has an IQ of 155 is meaningless. It's a statement that's not even wrong. But more importantly, accuracy is not even the relevant question here. whether or not AI works in a certain sense, whether or not you can make decisions by asking a chatbot what to do about various things when it comes to governance, a system like this will simply have no democratic legitimacy. It is missing the point of government. Just imagine whatever your views are on any contentious topic like book bans. Would you accept the decision that your city made just because the mayor deferred to this supposedly unbiased machine? I would assume not. And if not, why would you expect anyone to accept a machine decision here? The point of government is really to work out these deep differences in our society. And to say that you're going to outsource that to a machine is to really misunderstand what governance is all about. Okay, so with that said, with those few examples of the ways in which AI can go wrong because it doesn't work well, because it works too well, as in the case of facial recognition for mass surveillance, or that it's simply unfit for purpose, regardless of how well it works. I want to give you a framing. This is a framing that we have in the introduction of our book, and we carry it forward throughout our chapters. We have this two-dimensional diagram, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but I want to give you a high-level idea of what's going on here. On the vertical axis, we classify AI according to whether it works or whether it kind of works, but it's overhyped, or whether we think it's just snake oil. There's no reason to expect that it works at all. And on the horizontal axis, which is independent of the vertical axis, we classify AI, or rather put it on a spectrum, according to whether we think it's benign or helpful to people, or whether it's harmful to people. And on the top right, you have a cluster of the classic kinds of technologies that we consider to be snake oil, the video interviews. We talked about criminal risk prediction. We talked about a little bit. And cheating detection is the idea that you can use AI to detect when students submitting their homeworks have used AI to cheat. So far, at least, those types of technologies don't work at all. And it hasn't stopped companies from selling these technologies to teachers. And it has led to a spate of false accusations for students, which leads to enormous amounts of stress and potentially miscarriages of justice, students getting expelled from school, and that sort of thing. And in the other corner are applications like autocomplete. These are things that work well. We don't really need to talk much about. We don't talk much about them in the book because you wouldn't want to read 300 pages about the virtues of autocomplete. So really, the book is about everything except the bottom left corner. So we talk about facial recognition, for instance. We talk about content moderation. And the point that we make there is that it is true that AI can make some of the decisions that content moderators make on social media. And what that refers to is enforcing the policies that Meta or other social media platforms have of what content can stay on and what needs to be taken down. And despite the ability of AI to do a decent job with those individual decisions, the way in which CEOs have often portrayed this technology, for instance, Mark Zuckerberg, in congressional hearings, that it's going to be the arbiter of these societal debates between, what is the right line between free expression on the one hand and curbing hate and harassment on the other hand, right? So those moral and normative debates, that we have to have it out as a society, where there is really no alternative to that kind of vigorous societal discourse. To say that AI is going to solve that problem for you is we think, just a deflection tactic. It's going to leave everybody disappointed. Okay, so I'll just take a couple of minutes to talk about what else is in the book, and then we'll go to the discussion portion of this. So we have a whole chapter that really isn't about AI at all. It's about why AI can't predict the future, but it's more really about what are the fundamental constraints that the universe, if you will, imposes on our ability to predict the future, and especially in sociological settings when it comes to people's behavior. We have a chapter about the history of AI, which in fact is longer than a lot of people think. We have a section that talks about how ChatGPT is the culmination of a gradual series of technological improvements that go back all the way about 80 years to 1943, which is when the idea of a neural network was actually first proposed. And that's important because there's a lot to learn from that history when it comes to the future. So we have a chapter about the future. about artificial general intelligence and existential risk. This is a topic that I think researchers should take seriously, but I think we think there's no reason for alarm, and the chapter explains why. We talk about who produces AI hype. Turns out many different parties, companies obviously, but also journalists and the academic research community produces a lot of it. And in strategic, we talk about the reasons why these entities are incentivized to produce AI hype, and that's why it's such a gnarly problem. And we have this principle that broken AI is appealing to broken institutions. One might think that if only we kept calling out AI snake oil and stopped these vendors from selling solutions that just don't work, then the problem will go away. But unfortunately, it's not so simple. We argue in the book that very often hiring HR departments, for instance, really want some form of automation because they are drowning in the number of applications that they're getting for each open position, and they're desperate for any technological solution. So that's kind of what we mean by broken institutions. And so if it's not AI, it's going to be something else that seems to act as a band-aid, but in fact is making the problem worse. We talk about regulation, what it can do, what it can't do. We really try to take a middle ground there. And then I'll mention one last thing, which personally is very significant to me, both in terms of my research and in terms of my own experiences with AI as a father, which is that not a lot of people are talking about what the lives of children, like, born today are going to be like, because they're growing up in a world where AI is going to be such a big part of their lives. And we have agency over this. It could be profoundly positive or profoundly negative and addicting or anything in between. And this is something we really need to figure out. And we, as a society, haven't really started on it, I feel. And our book has a few thoughts. That's, in fact, what closes out the book in the final chapter. So I hope you've found this set of topics interesting. I will stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I would like us to maybe begin by exploring the idea of bias in the development of AI, and to what degree is AI a mirror of the mind of the developers?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. And thanks, Arvind, for that great presentation. So I think the question of bias is definitely like an important one when it comes to how AI is sold. I think we have seen time and time again that a lot of AI algorithms lead to exacerbating the inequalities that already exist in the world. And some of it is definitely due to the past data that these models are trained on. But one of the key reasons we wrote this book was because when we sort of communicated these ideas about some types of AI not working at all within our communities, within AI research communities, we saw that treating it from the perspective of bias sorts of skips over the real problem. And in some cases, we think the real problem actually might be that AI does not work at all. So in the example that Arvind shared, like the job-seeking algorithm, it can be a completely unbiased algorithm if all you're doing for each job candidate is to flip a coin. That algorithm would have no bias, no racial bias, no other demographic bias at all. And actually, many of the companies that are selling such tools claim that they have built these unbiased algorithms. And we suspect it's partly because they're building tools that just do not work at all. And in fact, I'll go one step further and like point out that when these companies have been probed, these hiring companies have been probed to show evidence that their product works, they usually are perfectly happy to have audits of whether their tool is biased. But to the best of our knowledge, none of these companies has ever agreed to an audit of whether the tool actually works. And so I think that is like a fundamental problem affecting a large amount of AI that claims to predict people's life outcomes and is being used all over the place today.
Which is not to minimize the issue of bias, right? And it remains a very important issue. So what we're trying to put forth is let's treat these as somewhat separate but related issues. Even if we minimize the problem of bias, we still have to figure out when should we even be using AI at all. And one perhaps surprising way in which these two interact is that looking at the example of these hiring automation tools, nobody's using them to hire professors, right? Or other, high status jobs in society, if you will. So these are typically used by companies to hire for positions that they don't value very much. So these kinds of broken AI tools are more often used on lower income people, on racial minorities, on people who, don't have a lot of different options, don't have bargaining power. And this is a form of bias that's not visible under traditional ways of defining the problem, right? So it's not that the tool itself is producing a biased response, but the way in which the organization, the institution is deploying the tool is fundamentally unjust in terms of, who's given certain opportunities and who is not. So those are some things we're trying to bring attention to.
Yeah, which, leads me to wonder about the way in which politics can sometimes collide with technologies, and the fact that you have some very, very rich, very influential people calling the shots insofar as how this is all going to be deployed. Could you talk a little bit about the danger of that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think over the last couple of years, especially after the launch of ChatGPT, we've seen a number of attempts by big tech companies primarily to shape the conversation on AI. And in particular, in the last chapter, we discuss the role of regulation and legislation and how these companies have been trying to influence it. One example that we speak about in particular is Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, in his Senate testimony, asked for more regulation on AI. And actually, that was a surprise to a lot of people because companies are typically thought to be opposed to regulation. But looking at what type of regulation OpenAI was actually calling for gives us a hint about why the company took this stance. And so in particular, the types of legislation that Altman was arguing for in his Senate testimony was essentially a license for AI developers. So now what a license would do is basically restrict the number of people who are allowed to compete with OpenAI, restrict their competitors in the field, having already achieved this like status of being incumbents in the field. I think it's much easier for them to not have to compete with a number of other startups. And so when it comes to regulation, I think it's not just that regulation is anti-innovation or that regulation will solve all our problems. I think there is a middle ground somewhere in between, which suggests that we should sort of keep an eye on regulatory capture while also looking out for regulation that sort of can generally advance the interests of society and generally advance the interests of the public. And I think this was a perfect example by Altman that not all regulation is useful. In fact, some might actually end up backfiring.
Interesting. Arvind, do you have any thoughts?
No, that's I think Sayash summed it up pretty well. One other thing we'll say is from the policymakers' perspective, there are so many stakeholders who are advocating for different things, right? So some people are concerned about AI as an existential risk. Some people are concerned about AI and discrimination. It's a hard position to be in. And policymakers are often criticized as being out of touch with the technology and the whole process as moving too slowly. There are certainly some kernels of truth to those criticisms, but by and large, we're part of the Center for Information Technology Policy here at Princeton, and a big part of our work is talking to policymakers and helping them be more tech informed in their work. And we've been generally, impressed with the way in which they've been willing to listen to different stakeholders, consider evidence, be more technically aware. And we're, cautiously optimistic, I think, for AI policy in the U.S. and around the world. There are a number of things we don't like the amount of influence that companies have over the process, but there are many things about it that we're optimistic about as well.
Good. And if you were to think about the kinds of questions that, say, lay people who are not in this field may want to ask of the technology and in their relationship to it, what would maybe some of those questions be for someone who's maybe civically minded?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the things we've tried to do in the book is to sort of give lots of examples of where people have done this successfully in the past. So I think one place to start is in your own local community, to figure out how AI is being used today in your community, whether there were appropriate processes around it. For example, like I live in Washington, D.C., and I've seen examples of AI face recognition deployed all over my neighborhood. I think it would be interesting to sort of go around my neighborhood and ask people if they were actually aware of this process happening, whether there were due processes involved. And that is a simple sort of way in which you can actually sort of get back to the question of how much agency you have over the future of the technology. And if it's okay, I'll read a small excerpt from the book where we sort of address this head on and address the question of what people can do as part of their communities in looking at AI. So this is on page 265 in the last chapter of the book, which is how can we change the current status of AI? If you work for companies or organizations that are planning to use harmful technology, one approach would be to counter these proposals based on all of the evidence we presented in the book. Especially if you play a role in the decision-making process, it's important to advocate against AI that can be harmful, especially predictive AI. You can also participate in local democratic processes. A hopeful example is San Diego's surveillance program. In 2019, the city installed 3,000 street lights equipped with cameras and microphones. But residents had concerns about over-policing and surveillance using AI systems built atop this data. Community organizer Khalid Alexander rallied a coalition of activists, including tech workers who could understand and explain the technical aspects of the surveillance system to resist the deployment of the system. The coalition's efforts were successful. The city put in place an ordinance to oversee all surveillance technologies and to allow public input into all future surveillance programs. So this was a quote from page 265 of the book. Again, I think this is just a small example of how communities all over the US and all over the world can take agency in how AI impacts their own lives. Because oftentimes we start by thinking about these sort of big humanity-defining questions about whether AI will kill us all. But an equally interesting place to start might be our own community.
Yeah. Since we have you in the room and you know a lot about this subject, what would inspire you? What development in AI would you like to see? If you could just create a hypothetical here, what would that be?
So I'll say that it's for me, it's the mundane that's the most exciting. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you have AI that is displacing creative labor of artists and many other types of creators. But what I want more of is Roombas, right? And this is what technology used to be about, right? Doing the things we don't want to do and free up our creative energy. And in our own research, we're trying to shift the needle a tiny bit towards this. And a good example of this is in the last couple of months, there have been so many claims by research teams that they have built AI systems that can automate scientific discovery. When we look closely into this, so far, we haven't been convinced by any of these claims. But more importantly, is that, should that be the goal? Is the goal of automating scientific discovery a coherent one? To us, the point of scientific discovery is human understanding of nature. So what does it mean to automate that? But that's not to say that there isn't a role for AI in the process of science. And we're working in a small way to change that. So one example of this is these days, most science is done with the aid of computer code, and oftentimes there are bugs in that computer code. This leads to a big problem called computational reproducibility, where either something's accidentally wrong or it's just so messy for another researcher to set up the code that an author of a paper has put out. that people don't do that work and build upon the computational artifacts released with a paper, right? So AI can actually help automate this process. It's not a creative endeavor. It is something mundane, requires a lot of messing around with installing the right programming libraries and that sort of thing to smooth things for researchers who want to be able to more easily build on each other's work, right? Removing some of the frictions in the scientific process. Just like the internet removed frictions in scientists being able to share work with each other, this is a step that can remove frictions in scientists being able to build on each other's work. And, to our surprise, people are tackling these problems that are both less feasible and less well motivated, like automating discovery, and fewer people building these important and necessary tools. And so we're trying to do that, and we're trying to nudge the community in that direction.
Sayash.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. I mean, one thing I will say is already a lot of the tools that we've seen deployed in the last couple of years have sort of drastically changed our own relationship with work. And so for everything that OpenAI did wrong with its release of ChatGPT, one thing that I think it did right was the fact that everyone across the world now has some sense of the capability of today's AI systems. So I think in some sense, seeing is believing when it comes to AI, and being able to access these tools that are state of the art, that are just like the best anyone has in a research lab. These tools being available to everyone throughout the world to play with is in some sense like a good thing, even though it does come with problems like teachers having to overhaul their curricula. I think like non-experts being able to play with these tools without having to pay exorbitant fees definitely is somewhat unique to AI as well. I mean, I don't think someone could have accessed these tools as easily to understand the limitations as well.
Yeah. Well, we have some questions coming through in the chat. Elizabeth says, I'm a public librarian. What can I tell a non-technical person to look for in terms of signs of snake oilness in news stories, AI products, etc.?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. Maybe we can take turns. There is just so much to say about this one. We did write an essay a year or two ago called, it was something like 18 pitfalls to look for in AI journalism, where we have a longer answer to this, but let me perhaps share some highlights. So one thing is that often what is called AI is just 100-year-old statistics that's been rebranded. It's at best a formula in an Excel spreadsheet. And it's important when we hear claims about AI to know whether it's actually a meaningful use of advanced AI, something that takes advantage of AI capabilities to do some of the more complex things that ChatGPT can do, right? Or is it just basic statistics? And if it's basic statistics, we shouldn't be fooled by claims that this is technology that's advancing at a really rapid rate, because it's not. When we talk about AI that's used in criminal risk prediction, for instance, what we've realized is that for the most part, what these tools are predicting is that people who have been arrested before are going to be arrested more in the future. That's really the whole logic to it. Everything else on top of that is just marketing claims that are intended to make it look more sophisticated than it is. Anyway, that's one. Maybe I'll turn it over to Sayash. I know there's a lot more questions coming in.
Yeah, very quickly, when it comes to news stories, I think one thing we've seen over and over again is how every news story about AI is accompanied by an image of a robot. Now, this is true even if we have AI that is more similar to a spreadsheet than it is to an actual humanoid robot. And I think the issue is so pressing these days that, like when we wrote this article that Arvind mentioned, someone from the LA Times covered it. And they were talking about how this was one of the pitfalls we described in news reporting. And that very same article also had an image of a robot accompanying it. And so I think this is somewhat like structural as well. I think news editors are looking for like more clicks, and we have seen news media become increasingly underfunded and increasingly reliant on clicks for sustaining their organizations. But at the same time, I think it might give this false perception that AI is robot, but AI means robots, when actually most of the AI tools we talk about these days have nothing to do with robotics.
So James says, Alison Gopnik at Berkeley claims it's better to view technologies like ChatGPT as quote unquote cultural artifacts like libraries or the printing press rather than artificial intelligences. Could you comment on this?
Sure. Maybe I'll take a stab at that. I mean, it's both, right? So someone had a nice article that was talking about something like 56 different metaphors for artificial intelligence. Maybe Sayash, you recollect what the exact title was. I don't have a link handy. There have been so many metaphors that people have come up with for AI, and the challenge is that they all have some usefulness. So specifically on cultural artifacts versus artificial intelligences, this comes up a lot in discussions of whether AI should be freely available, whether anyone should be able to download the weights, right, the quote unquote brains of an AI like Meta's Llama, which Meta releases publicly. Is that too dangerous? How should we look at this? So from the perspective of cultural artifacts, it would be crazy to say that cultural artifacts should be proprietary, that they should be locked up, only like 4 companies in the world should be able to build them. But from the perspective of everyday products, right, we don't demand that the source code for the iPhone be publicly available. We understand that companies have certain proprietary interests. And so it really depends on the context. And I think metaphors can be useful, but they can also mislead. So I think we should take what is good from each metaphor and avoid what is misleading.
Let's see. Sayash, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that sounds great. Yep.
Okay, good. So Mike says, as noted in your chart, quote, image generation for stock photography, unquote, is one thing. And as a photographer, I agree that it is generally not harmful, but image and video generation for deception is similarly functional. However, it is entirely different and can be very dangerous. Why is this not on your chart? And is it discussed in your book?
Maybe I can start from the second question and then move on to the first. So absolutely. I mean, image generation and video generation for deception, but also for other types of misuse is extremely problematic. We do discuss this a fair bit in the book. In particular, one of the things we've seen very recently is AI image generation used for non-consensual deepfake pornography. And we've seen this spread across like schools. We've seen this primarily targeting women. And I think that's like an example, a very good example of something that works very well and is like quite harmful. And so I think the thing to sort of point out for the chart and the way we came up with it is that we're not necessarily just talking about the underlying technology or the technical artifacts, but also how they are used in the real world. So for example, the same technology that underlies face recognition is also used for detecting your dog in your Google Photos library. It's also used for Face ID when you're unlocking your phone. And it can also be used for surveillance and face recognition in the context of surveillance. And so in some of those contexts, this technology is extremely harmful, which is surveillance for face recognition. And in other contexts, the same technology might be completely benign, such as Face ID for your iPhone. So the stance we take in the book, and our stance more generally on this, is that when it comes to this type of technology, often described as a dual-use technology, what we really need to do is to figure out how we can incentivize, but also promote through like legislation, the types of uses of this technology that are beneficial or benign, while also using regulation and legislation to ban or curtail or restrict how much people can use these technologies for harm. So when it comes to the question of image generation in particular, right now, multiple states, including the state of New Jersey, have legislation that criminalizes the production of non-consensual sexualized deepfakes. And I think that is precisely the way to go when it comes to targeting the creation of or the use of image generation tools for real-world harm.
Did you have anything to add to that, Arvind?
No, I think that's great.
Okay, good. So Christopher comments, you express skepticism towards those predicting that AI will be very transformative in the not too distant future, like Sam Altman. What sorts of evidence are you watching for, short of this actually happening, that would cause you to revise your skepticism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, there's a lot that I agree with Sam Altman on, and credit where credit is due. Even before OpenAI, I think Altman clearly saw the potential of this technology earlier than a lot of people did. I remember very clearly a blog post that he had when he was part of Y Combinator back in 2013, talking about how impactful deep learning was going to be for the world. And when I read it back then and thought about it, that caused me to change my own beliefs and appreciate that this was going to be more transformative than I was giving the technology credit for. And yeah, he's clearly done a lot of things right to be where he is today. So where we disagree with him, though, is that even though the technology itself is progressing rapidly and will probably continue to progress, whether it's through scaling that is making these models bigger or through some other means, just because technical capabilities advance doesn't mean that they're going to be used for all the things that technologists or economists would say, that it's efficient to use them for. Let me give you just one example. In the last couple of weeks, uh, one of the applications of AI that's been in the news is enabling police officers to automatically generate incident reports from body cam footage and other things. So today, after they arrest someone, for instance, my understanding is that they have to spend a lot of time filling out paperwork, but technically all of that could be automated based on information that's captured through cameras and other police databases, perhaps. So why should police officers have to be doing paperwork when it could be automated and their time could be freed up for more important things? Right. So this, to me, this is a good application of AI. You really need to put a lot of guardrails there, but I think we should be exploring these types of AI applications. Where we differ, though, is the pace at which we think these things are going to be adopted. It makes sense today. It doesn't mean it's going to be adopted today. You're going to need the court system to figure out new rules for, what's the accountability here, right? If the AI makes a mistake and someone is wrongly accused as a result of that, what happens? What's the remedy, right? So those types of things where our institutions need to change, that happens on a time scale of a decade or more, not on a time scale of 1 to 2 years. And while I gave this one example, everywhere we're looking for transformative effects, whether it's in healthcare or finance or whatever, we always run into these problems. Messing with these systems that are important in our lives is not that easy. And technologists like to talk about AI safety, but forget about AI safety, right? These existing highly regulated systems have worked out their own safety protocols, right? Whether it's the court system overseeing police officers or medical testing protocols and so forth. And so that's the kind of inertia in existing systems that makes us skeptical that there is going to be any type of overnight transformation. But over the next 10 to 20 years, who knows? It's certainly possible that radical visions might come into fruition.
Sayash, do you have any comments for that?
Yeah, no, I think that very captures our thoughts on this very well. One example that I really like is I think 10 years ago, the technology that was going to be transformative in the next 6 months or whatever, 10 years ago, the technology was the cloud. And you had all of these predictions of companies sort of moving to the cloud, fixing all their problems and whatever. And it was the silver bullet people were going after. And to be clear, moving all of your applications, having servers that are in data centers has proven to be very useful for a large number of people. And yet industry adoption of the cloud or industry adoption of cloud services is at, I think, around 25% right now. So it has taken 10 years for 25% of companies that could have sort of migrated to the cloud to get onto it. So I think in many cases, what we really need to sort of think about is how quickly do people adopt this technology? How quickly does it become useful in a large number of industries, in a large number of productive sectors of the economy when we are looking at transformative impact? It's not just the point of creation of a particular technology that's important here. It's also the process of diffusion through these different sectors of economy. And if you look back at like past historical transformations, in all cases, it has taken like decades, not years, when it comes to seeing the transformative impact. And to be clear, I think we agree that in many cases, especially for knowledge workers, AI will be transformative. It just won't be transformative in the way people are predicting in like the next 6 months. We don't really need to fear for our jobs in the next 6 months.
I think we have time for one more question. Andrea comments, what can the development tech team triad, engineers, product managers, designers, do to push against snake oilness products pushed by senior leadership to be developed in a company?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think the short answer is you can send them our book. But the slightly more serious answer is, I think time and again, we see and we've heard of stories of companies pushing their employees and senior leadership pushing their employees to sort of take decisions that are beneficial in the short run. So let's say you want to raise VC money and you want to sort of increase the reported accuracy of your model. These decisions definitely might be interesting or useful for these companies in the short term. But I think adopting a slightly more longer term perspective and going back to, so this like the tech team triad, going back to the management or senior leadership with a slightly longer term perspective of what really goes wrong when these inaccurate claims are sort of tagged onto their products can be very helpful. So we've seen in the last couple of years, examples of many companies actually being tried in the code system. We have seen companies claiming that they use AI when what they're actually doing is, using humans behind the scenes. And this is not really a sustainable way to build a business. So I think one of the most sort of compelling arguments in this position might just be to focus on the slightly longer term, like what happens once you ship this product, which clearly does not work, and yet it's in front of consumers and in front of regulators.
Arvind?
Maybe one quick thing I'll add is collective action. When management thinks it's one employee pushing back, that's a very different story than when they recognize that there is deep discomfort among the rank and file with a certain direction that the leadership is pushing. So the more internal channels of frank communication there are within the company, the more people from different parts of the organization can get on board with pushing back against misguided directions.
Well, we find ourselves at the top of the hour. This has been a very stimulating, very eye-opening discussion, and I thank you both for all that you do and for gracing our virtual halls and allowing us to launch this important new book. I mean, it has been a pleasure having you here with us.
Thanks so much. This was really fun.
So everyone, we have posted links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard to our Arvind and Sayash website. Also, we posted links with which you may purchase the books. Please do subscribe to their newsletter. And, if you're in the hood, come on down, buy the book in person. City Lights is located on the corner near Columbus and Broadway. We're open from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., 7 days a week. One of the great browsing experiences of San Francisco. We look forward to seeing you. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So long, everybody. Take care. We hope to see you all again soon.